What's up, everybody? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to the extended cut, minimally edited podcast version of this week's video. And one thing that I've been reflecting on quite a bit lately in the last year or so is just how much of a bubble I'm in and kind of building this career that I really love, but also that may not necessarily reflect the experience of the typical or average therapist. So when I reflect on our profession, our field as therapists, rather than taking the perspective of what do I think about my own experience as a therapist, I start to think of it more of I wonder how other therapists would answer this question or think about it, because maybe other people are having a very different experience than I am. So I've been relying much more on feedback from others, including posting surveys to Instagram, and this week I was really curious to ask you all to share how you felt about being a therapist. Particularly, if you could go back in time and do the whole thing over again, would you still choose to become a therapist? And y'all showed up. I got 345 responses to this question, and I also had an option to offer kind of expanded text replies, and 32 of you added additional information to why you responded the way that you did. So I thought for today's episode, I would share the information that came up from those responses and also just kind of dissect it a little bit, if you will. So without further ado, let's dive into these responses so we can try to answer this question: would therapists still choose this profession if they could start over? So the initial question that I posted to Instagram stories was, if you could go back in time, would you still become a therapist? And people could answer yes, no, or unsure. Because, we're therapists. We're not prone towards black and white thinking, and I wanted to give the option of putting something in the middle. And I'm glad I did, because out of 345 total responses, 86 said that they felt unsure about whether they would still become a therapist if they could go back in time. So that's exactly 25% of people who responded saying they're unsure. But the good news is 64% of those who responded said yes, they would choose to become a therapist even if they could go back in time and do it all over again. That's 220 of the people who responded, so I take that as good news overall. And then 11% of people who responded said no, they would not become a therapist if they could do it all over again. So that means that in total, 36% of people who responded either said no, they wouldn't become a therapist, or they were unsure. Maybe it kind of depends on certain things. So about 1 in 3 therapists is at least waffling about it, and about 2 in 3 therapists feel pretty good about being a therapist. I'll say going into this, before I posted the poll to Instagram, I was genuinely unsure what folks would say, and I'm also very aware that I have a specific kind of self-selected group of therapists following my content, so whatever folks said in the survey may or may not represent, the broader profession as a whole. I was just curious to see what people would say, but I actually found myself feeling quite hopeful at the 64% of people saying yes, that they would choose to be a therapist again. But now that I'm saying it out loud, 1 in 3 therapists saying they're at least unsure about whether they would become a therapist if they could do it all over again, that's not the greatest. That's not the greatest outcome from this poll either. Fortunately, I'm glad I posted a prompt inviting folks to expand on their reply in an open-ended text response to the prompt, say more about whether you'd still be a therapist if you could do it over again. And we definitely got some replies. 32 people offered their responses, and I tried to organize it into themes. As I looked at the replies, it looked like, generally speaking, folks were responding either advocating for why they generally had a positive experience as a therapist, or a reply generally advocating for why they had a negative experience as a therapist. So I tried to group things together into positive reasons why folks are satisfied being a therapist, and then negative reasons why folks are maybe not so satisfied being a therapist. Now, of the replies that were on the more positive side of things, advocating for why somebody would still choose to be a therapist if they could do it over again, I was pretty surprised to find that they all kind of neatly fit into one category. I titled this category, "It's My Calling / It's extremely rewarding." Almost every single response that was positive about being a therapist fit in this category. So let me read to you some of the replies that folks gave in this category. "I love my job. It's a privilege to work with teens and hear their stories that they don't tell anyone. I have to. It is my calling. It's a sacred honor to be part of my client's healing journey. I found out I was made for this. Yes, I love working with others to improve their lives, keeps me accountable to do the same. I love seeing clients' aha moments. Watching someone heal is incredibly beautiful. Yes to therapist, I love helping others. I feel like I'm supposed to do this work. I would perhaps start private practice sooner. I love what I do, but I'd know my worth as a pre-licensed therapist. It's super rewarding to help people, and it helps that it's also lucrative. That's an interesting reflection. I love being a therapist, and I feel it's my calling from God. Clearly, these are all different responses, but they have just such a similar thread to them, at least to me as I read them. They just felt like, hey, this is what I was made for. This is my calling. This is so rewarding. And I realize as I'm reading through these responses, it probably would be helpful if I shared my response to this question of whether I would be a therapist if I could do it all over again. And for me, it is an emphatic yes. I have shared in a video a long time ago now, I think, that if I could go back, I probably would have gotten a master's level degree instead of a doctorate. I'm not going to hash that one out in this video since I already covered it, so I'll link to that in the description below. But I would most definitely still become a therapist, hands down. Love this job. I mean, folks are basically taking the words out of my mouth for what I would describe as far as how I feel about this job as a therapist. It feels incredibly privileged. I love it. It's a good fit for me. And I really like this particular response where someone said, I love working with others to improve their lives, keeps me accountable to do the same. I notice for myself that when I have a healthy balance in my caseload, I'm not taking on more clients than I can handle in a particular season. Seeing those clients tends to motivate me to do the same and work hard towards my own self-awareness, well-being, being a better mom, being a better spouse, reflecting on questions that, quite honestly, if I weren't seeing therapy clients or something similar, I might just be like blissfully ignorant of systemic issues in the world. I could just be like in a very privileged and comfortable place. I'm still in a very privileged and comfortable place, but I could opt to just lean into that in my internal world. But because I see my clients choosing to grapple through what can be sometimes incredibly challenging issues, seeing them go through that motivates me to choose into taking a harder path, thinking through things that are uncomfortable, or trying to find ways to grow and expand my awareness where I am able to. And I don't know where I would be, honestly, if I weren't a therapist. I mean, I don't know, to me, it's like I would have had to found another avenue to hopefully be a good enough spouse and mom and all of that, because I was a hot mess, honestly, before becoming a therapist. So I'm very grateful that this particular career path has also supported my own mental well-being. And I know that that's not universal or true for everyone, but I am hearing it echoed in the responses of at least some people who responded. That said, there were a few positive responses that I kind of just put in the miscellaneous category. So I'll read a couple of those to you as well. One person says, love the flexibility as a mom. I can see just 15 clients a week. And it's meaningful work. Now, I'll say there's some people who responded on the negative side saying it wasn't so flexible. So again, we're catching some of the nuance. Also, I would add 15 clients a week is full-time. Okay, let's just let that be in the ether. And for those of you who are working at a place where you're expected to see 30 or 35 or more clients a week, just know that in my mind, you're working 2 full-time jobs. Okay, hot takes with Marie, right? Some of the other responses in the miscellaneous category are a bit nuanced, like a little good, little not so good. Someone says, I would still stay a therapist as long as I knew I could keep doing my own practice. LOL. I don't think I would want to be a therapist if I did anything other than my own private practice. I mean, I hear you. Someone else says, I love being a therapist, but I never explored other possibilities. So, okay, so some folks are kind of in the middle ground in some ways, but that's just a little taste of some of the more miscellaneous responses on the positive side. So again, let me reiterate that almost everything on the positive side of being a therapist falls quite neatly into this category of it being my calling or it being extremely rewarding. There's not like a long list of other reasons on the positive side of things, but it seems to carry quite a bit of weight in therapist responses for feeling quite satisfied with their career. All right, so let's now move on to responses that fit onto the more negative side of things. advocating for therapists potentially being unsure, or saying like, no, I would not be a therapist if I could do it all over again. And I saw generally two broader themes pop up on the negative side of things. One that I titled poor pay / lack of benefits as a deterrent, and another that I labeled as demands are too high / licensure is too difficult. And in my mind, those kind of all fall under the same umbrella of not getting adequately compensated. If we're having poor pay and poor benefits, of course, we're not being compensated well. But also if we're being overworked or there's too many hoops to jump through to get licensed, if we were more adequately compensated, those might also not be as much of an issue. So let's read some of the responses folks gave in the poor pay and lack of benefits category. Getting a PhD was a long road, and sometimes I don't feel well compensated for a doctorate degree. Someone else says, I would have attended a public school for my master's degree to save money. I love the job, just wish I had a higher income. Someone else just says financial part for the reason why they're either unsure or they said no. Someone else says, I would have gone into another helping profession that makes more money. Are we hearing a theme here? Yes. Someone says, knowing that it's not a sustainable job for 40 hours, I feel there must be other work. And someone says, usually uncertain salary, unpaid vacation time, and no benefits in private practice. And the last one in this category, no, I love the flexibility now, but fee-for-service work is draining, no paid time off, no healthcare, frowny face. And here's some of the responses that I put in the category of the demands being too high or that licensure is too difficult. Someone says, I have so much respect for therapists, but that process to get licensed was so difficult. Someone says, I don't know because I hate paperwork so much, LOL. Someone else says, the caseload, documentation, and liability demands to maintain a decent living are high. I came back to agency work for stability even though I don't enjoy it, but seeing 35 clients in private practice is too, and then it kind of trailed off. I didn't get to read the rest. But I think we can kind of fill in the blanks that this person feels like that's not working for them. And someone else says, being pre-licensed, it's hard to be optimistic. The amount of hours and insufficient is tough. I think maybe that was a typo there, and I wonder if they meant insufficient pay is tough. I don't want to assume, but that's kind of what I assume. And the last person says, I'd go a different route and become licensed much sooner. So that overall sums up the responses folks gave in this particular poll for either why they would totally become a therapist if they could do it all over again, or why they're not so sure, or they would definitely not become a therapist if they could do it all over again. Now, of course, I'm looking at the survey information from my own lens. I'm a human being. I have biases. So please take everything that I'm saying with a grain of salt. But to me, as I look at it through my eyes, it seems that for the folks who responded yes to this question of, definitely I would become a therapist if I could rewind and do it all over again, it seems like they found some sense of balance between the work feeling like meaningful, rewarding work with clients and being compensated enough to support their livelihood. Or if they feel like they're not being compensated enough, then perhaps they're prioritizing the value of how meaningful the work is enough that they're still willing to choose the profession even if it feels like it's not compensating them enough. And then on the other hand, it seems to me that for those who said they're at least unsure about whether they'd become a therapist again, or they definitely would not become a therapist if they could do it all over again, they just couldn't seem to justify the calling and the sense of meaning that comes from the work, given how poor the compensation and benefits were, or just how difficult it is to become licensed, or how overworked they have to be in order to do this job. The balance just isn't there, so they would rather opt out. Now, as far as my reaction to seeing these responses, on the one hand, I'm not totally surprised. I mean, I've heard these kinds of responses in other similar surveys I've done for this channel before, so that part wasn't surprising. But I was a little bit surprised by just how neatly people's responses tended to fall into these kind of two categories. The positives all sounded very similar, and the negatives all sounded very similar, and folks just mostly seeming to be torn between those two. So if we just take things at face value and look at it on the surface, it seems like this is a relatively simple problem, but the solution to the problem might be a little more complicated. Now, I tried looking into it a little more to see if there's any available studies, surveys, research about how satisfied therapists are with their career, and I was kind of surprised to find that there is not much out there, at least in the broader sense. There's definitely research looking at more nuanced specifics. For example, there are a fair amount of research studies looking at how satisfied therapists are when using a specific therapeutic orientation or modality. But in my opinion, and I think probably most people would agree with me, that whatever therapeutic approach you tend to use is probably not one of the higher contributing factors to how satisfied you are with your work. Though I will say there was one person who responded saying that once they found their modality, suddenly they loved their career. They said, "Yes, but I would want to discover brain spotting way sooner in my career. It brought new joy to my work. Love it now more than the beginning." So of course, as always, there's exceptions. But I imagine for the average therapist, at least, we probably wouldn't anticipate that whatever therapeutic orientation we lean towards is what determines how satisfied we are. I think based on folks' replies here and just kind of common sense, it probably has more to do with, how effective we feel that we are with our clients, if we feel like we're being compensated adequately and we have a decent enough work-life balance in our lives. So maybe we can have more research studies on those things. But I will share a couple of things that I did find in the land of the internet, so let's take a look. There's a website called Career Explorer that I hadn't heard of before, honestly, so I don't know how legitimate the information is that they have here, but they have a piece on their website called "Are Counselors Happy?" And they say right at the top, "Counselors rate their happiness above average. At Career Explorer, we conduct an ongoing survey with millions of people and ask them how satisfied they are with their careers. As it turns out, counselors rate their career happiness 3.5 out of 5 stars, which puts them in the top 31% of careers." Now, that's a big claim, and as I heard that, I thought, where did you come up with 3.5 out of 5 stars? What did you just say? How satisfied are you on a scale of 1 to 5? And they have a few different variables that they took into account. So the first variable they take a look at is, are counselors happy with their salary? And counselors rated their satisfaction with their salaries as a 2.7 out of 5. And it goes on to say here, counselors tend to be quite unhappy with their salary, with very few reporting satisfaction with their pay. And sure enough, their report here shows that only 10% of counselors gave 5 stars for their salary, and only 17% gave 4 stars for their salary. Everybody else was 3 stars and less, so that's not great. But there's a number of other variables that they take a look at, which I think are important to ask, but also may have kind of skewed how they came up with these results. So some other variables that they looked at are, do counselors find their jobs meaningful, which came out to 3.8 out of 5. That aligns with what a lot of you all said in this survey I put out. Another variable they look at is, how well are people's personalities suited to everyday tasks as counselors? And for that one, folks rated 4.1 out of 5. The next variable they look at is, how enjoyable is a counselor's work environment? And that one, folks rated 3.8 out of 5. And lastly, they looked at, are counselors making the best use of their abilities? And that one rated 3.5 out of 5. So when you take all of these variables and put them in combination, the total score comes out to 3.5 out of 5 stars, which relative to other careers is quite happy. So one thing I wonder about as I read this is it possible that the combination of variables and how they weighted each of them doesn't necessarily amount to happiness overall? Because, even if everything about your career is great except your salary is poor, if it's poor enough, you may still be very unhappy. So in that sense, I'm just not sure if things shake out to a 3.5 out of 5 stars on a happiness scale based on the variables they factored in. But it is really interesting to see the individual variables broken down, and those seem to display the same kind of dichotomy that we talked about in the replies folks sent in. The work itself is incredibly meaningful and can be quite satisfying, but oftentimes the pay is really poor. So what do we do with that? Now, it was around this point in my research for this video that I remembered this statistic I heard probably, 15 or 20 years ago now, that therapist suicide rates are higher than suicide rates of other professions. So I went back and checked, and that statistic is still true, that suicide rates for therapists are higher than suicide rates of other professions. So I know I just took a really serious turn, but that feels so important to acknowledge, that even though our work on average seems to be much more meaningful, much more satisfying than the average career path, we also, on the flip side, have much higher suicide rates than the average career path. Again, this dichotomy of things are really meaningful and satisfying, but also something is not right for a lot of folks, at least. I want to take a moment and pause on this note and just acknowledge that if you're watching this and you're relating with that experience of feeling like life's not worth living, or you're questioning whether it's possible to have hope and build a life that's worth living, you're not alone. And if you're a therapist, especially still, you're not alone, and it's never too late to get help. So if you were in need of a little nudge to encourage you to maybe scale back on your work, ask for help, reach out to a therapist, whatever it might be, take this as your gentle reminder and nudge to do so, because it is so important to take care of ourselves, especially given the work that we do. So pivoting back into our topic for today, if it is possible that being overworked for too little pay is kind of the primary variable making our work not satisfying for those of us who would give that answer, I want to reiterate something that I've shared about in videos in the past, that we have a huge systemic issue that does not value mental health care enough. And that also is reflected in how many dollars are invested in mental health care. As a result, therapists who are working within the system are also not cared for well and not compensated adequately. So as I've said before, and I will probably say over and over again, because this is a systemic issue, we cannot place the burden of resolving that issue on the individual therapist. Given that, it's up to each of us to decide how we want to play out our career. So let me be explicitly clear about a belief that I hold. Mental health care should be more adequately funded on a systemic level. Period. Full stop. And for those of us who still choose this profession, despite how inadequately funded it is, it's up to each of us to decide based on our individual needs and values how to go about doing this career. Now, that may mean for some folks they opt out of this profession altogether. Some folks may opt to choose a more profitable route of their career just so that they can fund their livelihood. And some folks may choose to work in a setting that doesn't have as high of compensation, but maybe it aligns with their values, or maybe for the moment that's what they're able to find right now, and they're making it work. Something I'm wondering as I reflect on your responses to this question is if it is possible that these two extremes are both true, that this is incredibly meaningful work and it's incredibly demanding and often poorly compensated. I do believe that we have to work harder than the average profession to take care of our overall well-being. I kind of think of it as similar to, say, a firefighter, where a firefighter might have to work harder to keep up their physical stamina and strength than the average profession because their profession demands so much physical exertion from them. And for us, our profession demands so much emotional and mental exertion that we may also need to expect to invest so much more in our mental and emotional well-being in order to stay healthy. Now, I'm sure there's way more nuance to this than my little Instagram poll could unearth. I mean, for example, I'd be really interested to see what nuances come out if we looked at therapist satisfaction for therapists who are working with higher levels of crisis in their clients and compared that to therapists who are working with clients who maybe are a little bit more stabilized in their needs. Could there be differences in the demands and satisfaction and even pay amongst those two different career paths? That's just one example. I have so many follow-up questions that I'd be curious about, but I thought it might be helpful to share this with you all in case you're needing a little bit of encouragement or validation, or maybe even a prompting if this is where you're at to shift something about your career, whether it's pivoting in a different route as a therapist or exiting the therapy route altogether, or whatever it is that you choose to do. Ultimately, I hope everyone feels a sense of agency to choose a career path that fits best for you, your needs, and your values, and yeah, your paycheck also. That's important. We have to pay for our lives. I don't want anyone to feel stuck in whatever the situation is if it's not a good fit for them. Well, thank you to everyone who participated in the Instagram poll. I'm always amazed how many of you respond, and I'm so grateful. And it makes videos like this possible, where we can share that information with others so that we can all learn and grow and reflect, expand, etc. And for those of you watching who maybe didn't participate in the poll, feel free to leave a comment below elaborating on reasons why you feel satisfied or not so satisfied as a therapist, so others can glean from your experience as well. And until next time, from one therapist to another, I wish you well.